The Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus went home, and the crowd came together again, so that Jesus and the disciples could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, "He has gone out of his mind." And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, "He has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of the demons he casts out demons." And he called them to him and spoke to them in parables. "How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but his end has come. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. Truly, I tell you, people will be forgiven for their sins and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they had said, 'He has an unclean spirit.' Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, 'Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you.' And Jesus replied, 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' And looking at those who sat around him, he said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother.'" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
You may be seated. When I was about 4 years old, I did something terrible. Or at least, I was pretty sure it was something terrible. I don't remember what it was, honestly, but I knew I was going to face the music if I got caught. And so, I did what any precocious, calculating, intelligent child would do. I hid under the bed. When I heard the heavy footsteps of my dad coming up the stairs, my eyes grew wide. Would my dad be angry? Would I be placed in timeout? Would he be disappointed? I resolved not to find out. When my father finally entered the room, I heard the question, though. "Andrew, where are you?" Without thinking, I blurted out, "I'm not telling!" So much for my poise under pressure. It turned out that my dad didn't even know about my unmentionable crime. He had just gotten home and wanted to see me. After inadvertently betraying my location, I sheepishly and fearfully crawled out from under the bed, confessed my sins, and bawled. I had misunderstood my father's purpose. I had assumed the worst and acted accordingly. Rachel used to work on the border of Arizona and Mexico with a group called No More Deaths, No Más Muertes. It was a faith-based humanitarian organization, still operational today, dedicated very simply to a single task: preventing the deaths of undocumented immigrants crossing the border from Mexico. Their basic operation was simple: provide food and water to immigrants in desperate situations, people who would die of heat stroke or starvation otherwise, often abandoned by their guides if they were too slow to keep up. The desert aid workers from this organization would render basic first aid when they could, tending to the bloodied, blistered feet of people who are crossing the desert in their best shoes, the only shoes they were allowed to bring, the ones they couldn't bear to leave behind. Many times, these immigrants hid from Rachel and from her fellow volunteers, mistrustful, understandably. It was not until the volunteers of No More Deaths called out, "We're from the church. Somos de la Iglesia, that these immigrants, many of them devout Christians, would finally come out of their hiding places. They had misunderstood the volunteers' purpose. They had assumed the worst and acted accordingly. In the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. was a leading voice in the civil rights movement. He spoke in churches and universities, in large cities and small, pleading the case for an end to segregation, pleading it to all who would listen. He spoke of the dignity of Black folks. He spoke of their inherent rights as humans and as Americans. He spoke about the evils of racism. And in the course of his work, he caught the attention of some very powerful people. Some claimed he was a communist sympathizer. Others slandered him as a liar. They thought he was dangerous. J. Edgar Hoover was an especially powerful opponent of MLKJ and set the FBI to investigate and intimidate him. Attorney General Robert Kennedy approved the wiretaps. The FBI used compromising materials they had gathered through their surveillance in a malicious effort to make MLKJ end his own life. They had misunderstood King's purpose. They had assumed the worst and acted accordingly. These three stories, in one way, couldn't be more different. And yet they are bound together by the threads that bind so many human stories together. They all illustrate how misunderstanding can lead to fear, to assuming the worst of others, and then acting accordingly in a way that brings harm. As the third story about MLKJ illustrates, sometimes even grievous harm. In our text for this morning, we see these same insidious forces at work. In our Genesis reading, we're taken to the primordial Garden of Eden, to a time long, long ago when God still walked among God's people. Our text picks up after a character named man has eaten fruit given to him by a character named woman, through the crafty encouragement of a character named snake. When God goes for God's nightly stroll in the garden to visit God's favorite and as of yet only humans, God is surprised that they are nowhere to be found. And so God calls out to them, "Man, woman, where are you?" Much like a scared 4-year-old, the man responds, and in so doing betrays his location. "I heard the sound of you, and I was afraid." He had misunderstood God's purpose. He had assumed the worst and acted accordingly. He tried to hide from the one who loved him most. In our gospel passage, Jesus and the scribes are making quite the scene. The scribes from Jerusalem, these are the big guns now, oppose Jesus because they think he is advancing the work of the devil. Jesus is exercising and healing and working in a way that they perceive to be outside of the law. These well-to-do, well-heeled religious folk from Jerusalem see the throngs of outcasts, lawbreakers, immoral people, tax collectors, and prostitutes all flocking to Jesus and assume that they are flies buzzing around manure. Surely, Jesus must have sin stink to attract such as these. And so the scribes accuse him of outlandish things, of casting out demons through demonic power. And like so many in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples often included, the scribes misunderstand this rabble-rousing rabbi. They look at the very work of God and call it sin. They assume the worst and act accordingly. Jesus' own family, regrettably, does little better. According to Mark, they come into the scene to restrain Jesus because they think he's out of his mind. They see Jesus going about his work, and while they may not think it's the work of the devil, They think Jesus has come unhinged, giving more of himself than he ought to give. They see the crush of people, the unrelenting waves of need that are breaking against Jesus, such that he and his disciples can't do the most basic tasks of self-care. And Jesus' family members resolve that they must do something. They must take charge of him. And so they go. And they stand outside the house he's sitting in, and they say, "Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you." They misunderstood Jesus' purpose. They couldn't bear to see Jesus expend himself for people like that. They assumed the worst and acted accordingly. I wonder how many of us can resonate with this very human pattern. I wonder if you've ever made an assumption about someone that you thought was going to be one way, and so it made you treat them poorly, with suspicion, with something less than kindness and a full embrace. In Eugene, I feel like this most often happens with folks who are unhoused. I recall one young man I found right out on our front doorstep here at church one Sunday morning. He was clearly unhoused, and I found myself bracing for the interaction. How is this going to go? Would he be surly or need a bunch of my time? I confess that my first thought was not, here is a child of God for me to connect with. It turned out that he just wanted to join us for worship. I had made assumptions, and so was initially less welcoming than I wish I had been. Or perhaps you've been on the receiving end of misunderstanding. As we celebrate Pride Month this June, I think about how many of our LGBTQIA+ siblings have experienced this age-old pattern of being misunderstood and mistreated. And we see the effects of this pattern more broadly as well. As we enter into an election year, I can't help but notice how, as a society, we're already falling into the same old patterns of misunderstanding, mistrusting others' intentions, assuming the worst of each other, and acting accordingly. Our public discourse has become toxic. We assume the worst from those we consider other and treat them that way. So how do we turn the tide? How do we work against the misunderstanding and the assumptions that lead to harm? I think the answer is pretty simple. Not easy, but simple. We treat each other, where we treat each and every person and each and every encounter with a posture of love, welcome, and curiosity. It's so easy to assume the worst, to judge, to presume, to assume. But there's a reason we have a saying about assuming. It's best to avoid it and to replace it with curiosity. How many misunderstandings could be avoided if we just got curious and asked a question or two? If we seek to understand the other, they cease to be truly other. The stranger can become an acquaintance can become a friend, and a friend can become a close friend. I said it was simple, but not easy. In truth, it's difficult to give the benefit of the doubt, to ask questions, to adopt a posture of welcome and care, especially if we've been hurt, maybe repeatedly, by people who look or talk or act a certain way. And the good news is that we are not left alone in this endeavor. As Jesus points out in our text, we receive a new family, new parents, and new siblings to join us in this sacred endeavor. We prayed in our psalm together earlier, "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear our voice." And so what is God's answer to our supplication? God's response, I think, to the problem of human fear, mistrust, and resulting misbehavior can be seen in the radical love that Jesus showed to those who seemed to many the scariest and the least worthy of trust. Jesus bore witness to God's prodigious, norm-shattering love by welcoming those who were least likely to be accepted. Thanks be to God, who shows us in Jesus what it means to turn would-be foes into friends and family. Amen.